Let's put this .NET 8 brand website live. I will show you how I deploy my own projects to Azure using GitHub Actions, the workflow files on GitHub. I'll start with the SQL Database, then the frontend to an Azure App Service, and lastly the API to an Azure App Service as well. So the next thing I'll do is redo the migrations. I'm going to delete all of these and alter the seeder data to only contain data that I want on the live version. So just the seed roles with one role. And I'll do that for all of the modules. And I'll now start fresh with new migrations with less dummy data. Always double check your migrations. And I'll now do the same for the blog module and the reviews module, creating fresh migrations. And now I'll drop my local database and update it, restore it based on with these new migrations and see if I actually got the result that I wanted, so less dummy data. So I'm dropping this and restoring it with the update command and applying the new migration. And I'm showing you that because we'll do the exact same once we have the production database, then use the production connection string instead of the local one. You will have to be a bit more careful when you're using that production connection string. And I think it's all there. If I now run the project, then that should not contain the dummy content. Let's have a look. So recent content is empty, that's good, and the testimonials are empty as well. Okay, so let's now make that database in Azure and obtain that production connection string so we can then migrate to that live database. So let's maybe start with a SQL Server, which will contain the databases. I don't have one yet for my brand website, so I'm going to create one. I'm going to create a new resource group, brand website, and a server name. And my region will be Europe West. And for the authentication, I'll just take use SQL authentication. I'll just call this I'm a SQL admin. And I'll generate a password. And let's just create that. Review, create. That's just a server. We still have to create the database. Let's go to the resource. Create a database. Brand website DB. Configure the database and set it to a way cheaper one. The basic, which is about $5. Apply. Just gonna put locally. And what you'll likely want to do now is go to networking and add current IP address to get access, so your current IP address can connect to the database. So creating a firewall rule to allow to whitelist your IP address. And that's enough for now. And let's go to that resource once it's created, and I'll want to get my connection string. If you did that, you'll want the bottom one with the SQL authentication of the ado.net. And it's gonna contain the entire connection string, but without the password, and that password should be filled in, and that's actually the password of the SQL Server that we created right before this database. So I hope you wrote down this password. And that's all I need for now. I can now go to the Azure Data Studio, the tool I use, and use that connection string. So this one was the local one. Let's see, add a, and then I need to add a connection string for SQL Server. And then I got an error saying that my server did not allow public access, the one we just created. And then take its network settings. And then we should allow this public network access. And let's try again to add our current IP address. We do have to allow Azure services simply for our API to access the database. And then that should have worked. Now I can connect, can access it. Let's take a look at the tables, which there are none yet because we did not migrate any of it. This I'm going to paste my production connection string in the app settings.development and then run my migrations while having that production connection string. And I'm just going to run all of the update statements. So update brand website is the first one. And now I'll do the same for all of the other modules as well. So now all my tables should be there in the production database. That administrator role seems good. Now, of course, I'm going to undo that app settings change because we want to be able to run locally and test and experiment in a local environment on a local database, not on the production database. One thing I want to add here, if you were to be working on the production connection string and you drop the database, let's have a look. Then it's possible that and then you restore the database by using an update statement. And then it's possible that that recreated database will be on a way more expensive pricing tier. So then you'll have to set that back to basic. That's only if you drop and restore the database programmatically. So that's gonna be set by default on the general purpose. Then you'll want to set it back to the basic to avoid a lot of costs. I don't think Azure will sponsor this video. So that was all for the database that's now live. Of course, I added that production connection string to my app settings in the implementation project, so the brand API. But let's first do the front end to an Azure app service. So create a new web app service, the resource group, and let's give it a name. I'm going to call it brand website SPA. Whoops. For single page app. Oh, and here you could also select static web app, but we can't use that because we're running a server-side project. And we're just gonna select the code because we want to... this is still preview. I hope this works. And then I'm going to select the Linux operating system, Linux, however you pronounce that. And I'll pick my region, which will be West Europe again. So the Linux runtime stack is sufficient for my .NET 8 application, since the .NET 8, the web apps I'm building are cross-platform, and I don't need to leverage any of the extra Windows capabilities. Also, the Windows 1 tends to be more expensive, and I would say is more for the older project types. And now pricing plan, that's actually pretty important. Maybe I'll just leave it at brand website, that new name. And here I'm going to select, so you have a free one, which might be sufficient for some hobby projects, but it's limited to 60 CPU minutes a day. So I'm gonna pick the second cheapest one, which has some more resources to it. So this pricing plan contains all of the available resources, so the 1.75 gigabytes of memory and 1 virtual CPU. So every web app, every app service I create on this pricing plan will have to share these resources. That's important to note. It's not like every web app or every app service has its own resources. The resources are tied to the pricing plan, which can contain multiple apps. I made a specific video about that as well, because I ran into a problem with my other project. I had like 10 or more web apps on one pricing plan, so sharing these resources. And I started to notice there was downtime at random. To solve my problem, I created multiple pricing plans and divided the apps over multiple pricing plans, which also made sense because app A had, I think, 3 or 5 app services that were related to app A, and then app C had 3 to 5 services related to app C. So that was logical to put those into pricing plan A and pricing plan C. Another solution would of course be to select a more expensive pricing plan with more memory and so on, but you see those costs really run up pretty quickly. And there is no choice between 1.75 and 8. So if I only need 3 or 5 gigabytes, then it might make more sense to make multiple plans instead of just scaling up right away. Enough about that. Next, deployment. And here we want to enable the GitHub Action settings, so I can publish directly from my GitHub account to the Azure live environment. So that's my GitHub account, organization, and then repository. Oof, I've got a lot of them by now. It's the brand website. And then the branch, we'll come back to that later. I will leave it at main for now, but I'm going to use release branches. So what would happen if I press create now is that a file, a workflow configuration, will be added to my GitHub repository, so this one, brand website, and then from then on, every time I merge code into the main branch or commit to the main branch, that will trigger a deploy to this web app service and put the new code online. Let's create that one. That's for the front end. So let's take a look at GitHub, and I've got this new workflows folder with the configuration in here. So now the first thing I like to do is prepend the name of the project in here instead of at the end, because in the GitHub Actions, when they run, I want to see immediately about which project is running. And then the next thing is the main branch. So every time code gets pushed, committed or merged into the main branch, that will trigger a new deployment. And here you can choose which branch this is. What I like to do is make release branches for that. And that's basically a branch, well, starts with something specific, and each time I make a branch starting with that prefix, let's say brand SPA, and then I have to use a wildcard. So each branch I make starting with brand SPA and then something else will trigger that new deployment instead of changes happening on the main branch. That gives a bit more control, so I could say, could have multiple as well. You could, for example, have different ones for the API or for the SPA, so for the front end and the back end, which gives a bit more control. So this is more intentional and gives you a bit more control over that deployment process. I'm going to stick with, feel free to name this front end, back end or whatever. I might just start with this. So if I use the branch brand, then maybe I want to publish both the front end and the back end at once. If I only use the brand SPA as the branch name, then I might only want to publish the front end and not the API, for example. So let's go down the rest of the file. And for the build phase, so these configuration files go through a few steps. So take a few actions before actually publishing that code, and it will first build, so .NET build, and then run .NET publish, and then do some other things. Yeah. So all the steps in here. You could even add a step to test run your tests first, or run your linting or whatever you want. You can all add that in there. But for this project, it's just simply, so we want to build a project, but we want to build, not just in the root folder. We'll want to go into the brand pre-render server. So it's gonna be brand slash, I think I have to, no, don't have to do that. I think it's going to be brand.pre-render server, because that's the runnable project for the Blazor WebAssembly pre-rendered frontend. And for the publish tab, it will also want to know where to look for the files. And then what I also like to do is change this my app to a better name. Let's call it brand SPA, like that, because that's where the output will, the published output will live. And if we put that in my app and then we deploy another project, the API for example, on the same app service plan, on the same, also with the name my app, I think that could overwrite each other. I'm not 100% sure, but let's better be safe than sorry and make this brand SPA. And then the other one will call brand API, but that's for later. And that's all there is to it. If we now create a branch starting with one of these prefixes, then that should trigger a deploy to the live environment, to the web app we created before. So let's commit this. And now I am going to merge my branch, the current branch I'm working on, into the main, but that won't trigger a deploy. And now I can create a new branch. Let's see, view all branches, new branch, and start it with brand SPA and say first deploy. So I'm branching off the main, since that now holds the most recent code. I could also have branched off of my KISS deploy branch, the one I was currently working on. So you can choose that. if that current branch contains that that GitHub workflow, of course. So you'd first have to merge with the main to get that pull, git pull, and merge with the main to get that workflow out. So let's take a look at the Actions tab, and then something is running. And that is going through all of these steps specified in the configuration file. We can see those here, build with .NET, publish. And building that project took about 3 minutes, so that's decent. It usually takes between 3 to 10 minutes. If it takes way more than 10 minutes, the GitHub action might have gotten stuck somewhere. That sometimes happens when there's something wrong with GitHub. So that's rarely happens, maybe once a year, twice a year. But then it's important to maybe cancel the workflow, because it might keep going forever, and that's going to, there are certain limits in time before you have to pay for these. These actions are free, but you only have, I think, 100 minutes or something. And that deployed after another 3 minutes. And at the bottom you get the artifact, which is basically the output of the build and publish. So you could, if you ever need to do a manual deploy, you could grab those. Oops. That is of your production version, of course. And now it even gives me the URL which it deployed to. That's the same URL if we were to go to the app service. That's the same URL in here. Another thing you could do, I think, is go check out the log stream. If there are any failures at app startup, then that might be logged as a container log. So this is basically the container logs. And then you get the stack trace in there. It's possible that you'll have to turn on this application logging, if I'm not mistaken. And that's what I just told you. So you see the app is starting. Errors to do that it can't connect with my API project. The only reason that I did the front end first is because now I have this URL to add to my API's course settings. So to enable access from this URL to the API, which I will deploy next. So I update my app settings for production on my API project to have the allowed origins. And that first one is that URL you just saw. Two below that are my custom domain that I bought yesterday. So I'll create a new app, a web app. I'll select the resource group that I want. I'll give it a name, brand, website, API this time. I'm going to deploy using code. I'm going to use the .NET 8 Linux West Europe. Use that same app service plan, which is set to the basic tier. Enable GitHub Actions, similarly as we did before. Brand, website, and I'll start with the main again. But one thing I forgot for the API app settings, production app settings, is that identity configuration to make sure that the account confirmation email redirects back to my actual production front end. So now that workflow file should be available on the main branch in GitHub. So I'm going to git pull to hopefully get those changes, and then git merge origin main, and that should give me the brand website API YAML, and we can even go to the file system, go to the GitHub folder, and now we have that new API file, and I can edit it in my beloved editor, IDE, push that to my branch, and then either create a new branch from this branch or from the main branch, whichever I choose. This time I'm going to say if I create a branch with the brand API prefix or just with the brand prefix, I want to deploy this API project as well. So it's possible that I create one of this, and then that will now trigger to deploy the API and the front end together. So to their own separate app service, of course, but at the same time. Or I could decide, I only made changes in the API project, so I only want to redeploy the API project. And I'm going to tell the build with .NET the working directory and also the publish one. And then this my app, I'm now going to change to brand API. And that's about it. I'm going to push that to GitHub. I'm going to cancel the current running workflow because that just got triggered because of making that app service for the API. So I canceled that one. That's the same that happened after creating that one for the front end. I'm now creating a pull request, a new pull request from my KISS deploy to the main, or I could directly branch off this KISS deploy branch, but let's put it in the main. And now I can make a new branch. Let's call it brand API, so I could also call it brand to also deploy the front end, but let's call this first deploy for the API. And let's take a look at the action, and that will take another 6 minutes probably. In the meantime, let's also turn on those logs so we can see if something bad happened. That seems to be deployed. Let's give it a minute to start up. And the API is live, and we're getting that message from the AllowedHosts middleware. I did forget a major detail for the front-end project, and that is I need that API URL in the app settings of the front-end to be able so that can do HTTP calls to the API, which defeats the purpose of me deploying the front-end first and then the API, since I now have to redeploy the front-end with the correct app settings. So let's redeploy that. I probably need that in my app settings of the client, the WebAssembly project, and also in the pre-render server. So a new pull request from KISS code to the main. So yeah, now you could say, oh, you're always merging to the main, so why didn't you pick the main to trigger the deployments? Well, for now I'm doing that, but in the future the setup I just configured will give me a more fine-grained control, as well as now I can just deploy the front end separately from the backend. So brand SPA, second deploy, and also creating these release branches, so it's easy to go back to the previous deploy and all that. You don't have to revert your main branch to any of the previous states with the risk of losing your progress live. And then the final thing I want to do is I don't want you to have to find me on this URL, so I'm going to bind a custom domain name to this application, and I do that by going to the front-end application, selecting custom domains, add custom domain, select all other domain services, enter the domain. So for me that would be kisscode.com, but I'm going to prefix it with www. and then kisscode.com. And then you should just follow the steps that will be generated below, validate, add, and then that should be added. I'm not going to show you all of that because that is sensitive information. And I'm going to enable application insights, and I configured Serilog to not log to the console, only to log to the application insights. So you could enable application insights just by going here and then enabling that. Okay, and then my last error for today seems to be the host is brand website API when doing requests from kisscode.com. And I set my allowed hosts to the plural to brand websites API. So that's a stupid typo that has cost me a few deployments. And then the very last thing I would do is get some basic page visit tracking on my new domain by going to the Google Search Console and add this domain by simply adding a txt record to kisscode.com. Similarly as binding the CNAME and the txt record we had to do for the custom domain to the front-end web app. And it seems like in the meantime everything deployed correctly, so we have the API that can return something and the front end on kisscode.com. So what I'll do now is register a user, give that the administrator role, and by using that I can start writing my blog posts. Since there's none yet. What you can do for me, of course, is share a positive experience. If you found any of my videos valuable so far, feel free to leave a testimonial. And definitely make sure to hit the like button on the video and subscribe for upcoming videos.